It's been like a really fun afternoon. I didn't know what to expect. I just want to start by saying that I love the framing of sustainable leadership. It's actually like two words that I haven't seen together. You know, I think we talk a lot about like adaptive leadership or moral leadership, or but the word sustainable, when Julian kind of invited me into this circle, I was like, it caused pause for reflection, you know, because I think, you know, sustainable is really like the invitation to think about how we can do what we love doing for a long period of time in a way that really, really nourishes us. And so, yeah, I'm excited to talk about it. And it kind of comes at a really interesting time for me, where I am transitioning out of an organization that I started 5 years ago. And part of it was actually because the leadership became unsustainable. It got to a point where, you know, both of us, me and my business partner, we just weren't thriving. So I'm going to talk a lot about that experience. And, you know, I want to know, this is actually something I've never talked about before. So it's a reflective process. It's a little bit new for me. And it's in the spirit of Mindshare, for sure. And it's also really personal, you know? So there's gonna be parts of it that don't resonate with you, and I feel like take what does and leave what doesn't. And, you know, I really, in this process of reflecting on my own leadership and what sustainable leadership is and what that looks like in the next chapter, you know, I really like connected with the fact that like leadership's like, it's like no joke, you know? It really is like such an honor and privilege to be able to be in a leadership position, to hold space for other people to create and grow and like hold a container for that to happen. And it's always actually been such a spiritual process for me, you know, like the organizations that I've been involved in or the teams that I've really created have just been the greatest teachers and the greatest mirrors for me. And so because I see leadership as such a spiritual process, in many ways it also is a really personal process. So there's kind of like three things that I'm going to talk about today. So the first one is detachment and looking at what our relationship is to ourselves as it relates to our leadership. And the second thing is like, what is our working style and like what actually are the ingredients that we need to thrive in our leadership? You know, there's going to be places that actually don't serve you to lead. And then the last thing is like, is kind of around integrity, you know, and what integrity looks like as it relates to power and politics and privilege and positionality and sort of like the big 4 Ps, which I'm not actually going to get into a lot because those are really big topics and we could spend a whole day talking about it. But really it's like, how do we have kind of hard conversations to, again, set ourselves up in a place of integrity so that our leadership really feels sustainable. So I'm Hima, and I am the co-founder of Reset. And Reset is a pet project that I co-founded with 8 other people 5 years ago on the side of my desk. And it kind of, the story is that I was out in San Francisco. I had lived in India for a few years. And I moved back to Toronto, and I was like, okay, do I want to be in Toronto? What do I want to do? Maybe I'll move to San Francisco. Everyone's moving to San Francisco. And so I went to San Francisco, and I stayed with a friend who was like, let's go out one night. And he was meeting a group of friends that they had all met at this place called Camp Grounded. And I was like, okay, whatever, cool, I'm down for the cause. And when I went there, I was like, oh, what is Camp Grounded thing? Like they were talking about inside jokes. They all had nicknames for each other. And it was this 4-day experience that they had all gone to that was, that had no phones, no work talk, no real names, and no photos. And it was at a summer camp for kids, but it was made for adults. And I just had like something happen in my body. I was like, I need to be at Camp Grounded. I don't know why, but there is something in my spirit that needs to be there. And so I was like, oh, you know, I'd love to come back for this. Came back to Toronto and was like, and had this kind of moment where I was like, you know, if I want to live here, I actually have to like create the city that I want to live in. And so I'd sent a message to my best friend and another friend, and I was like, we should create something like this here. And they were both like, yes, like immediate yes. which, like, you know, if you, at a certain point in your life, you realize it's actually really hard for a group of people to say yes at the same time. There is like some divine order that happens that 3 people said yes, and then all of a sudden 8 people said yes. And so that kind of catalyzed this journey of starting Reset. And so it's been around for 5 years. We've hosted about 6 camps, about 650 people have gone through the experience, and it's taken place in different parts outside of the city, out in Halliburton and in Aurelia and up in Hockley Valley. And you know, when at our first Reset, I was like, this is gonna be a great experience. Like, it's gonna be fun. We're gonna come together for 4 days. It's gonna feel like a big cottage party. There was about 100 people at the first one. And it ended up being so much more. It ended up being like transformational in a way that I could have never predicted. It was like so much beyond my imagination. And over the years, it's always been so tough to describe truly what it is, because the only way that I can describe it is that it's a feeling, you know, in so many ways. But it's a boot camp for presence. And actually, like, a lot of things that we've done over the last 2 hours, it's a lot of that, but for 4 days, and in nature, and with all the fun things of a summer camp, and with 200 other people. And so it's just been really the most, like, beautiful, beautiful growth experience of my life, and I feel really, really grateful for it. So that's a little bit about Reset. And I have decided to transition kind of out of the organization this year, and it's been a really hard process. You know, it's been like a tremendous amount of grief, and you know, over the years, like, as we started Reset, it was 8 co-founders, and then it moved to 5, and then eventually moved to 2, which was like me and my business partner. And through those years, I really actually developed quite an attachment to the organization. You know, it started to become a reflection of who I was. And you know, when something went wrong in Reset, something was wrong with me. When something said something terrible about Reset, someone said something terrible about me. You know, when we weren't able to perform, I wasn't able to perform. And so I'm sure this is maybe something that people can relate to, and I also am sure that other people have much healthier relationships to the things that they do in the world. But part of what became unsustainable was that both of us had these attachments to this organization. And so actually what started to happen in our leadership was that it was I want to do this. Well, I think we should do this. This is what I think. When actually, like, you know, when I say like leadership is such an honor, and like you are actually holding space for something to grow, when you create something and you put it out in the world and you invite other people into it, it is no longer yours. You know, it is like shaped by everybody that experiences it. It is shaped by everybody that comes into contact with it. It actually starts to develop its own consciousness, and it is a collective consciousness, you know? And like what's been really beautiful about Reset is, like, you know, 200 people come to this thing for 4 days, and then it's kind of a community that exists throughout the year. But I actually don't know half the things that happen, right? Like, I may be leading it and thinking about it and planning and putting all my blood, sweat, and tears, but the experiences that people have are like, they're beyond what I would ever understand. And so in many ways, like, everybody that has come to Reset feels like they actually own a part of it, you know? And so part of the detachment process with Reset has been like understanding that, like, that you are really a steward of the organizations that you create. You're a steward of the creations that you make. Once you put it out in the world, they're no longer yours. And when you're able to do that, you actually start to see that, like, this is who you are and this is what you do, you know? And who you are is so much more bigger than what you do, even though what you do is really beautiful and it's really important, and they come together and they intermingle and they find resonance, but they are not reflections of each other, you know? There's such a, like, as I've moved into this next chapter in my life, where I've taken on a role at Artscape, which is a nonprofit organization in the city, it's been so incredible to not feel an attachment to that. Where I was like, oh, I get to like go in and do these things and lead and create, but like it isn't who I am. It's actually just like what I do. And there's like a peace that has come with that and a freedom that has come with that. And I think when I think about sustainable leadership, I think about how to cultivate some of those feelings, because the attachment really meant that when I was down, the organization was down. When I wasn't feeling good, the organization wasn't feeling good. And it really wasn't in service to actually that privilege of being a leader. And you know, as we've gone through the detachment process over the last year, like I actually started to refer to reset as its own thing, right? As its own consciousness. So like, you know, we'd have this like incredible meeting and people would be saying all these great things about reset. And I would be like, you know what, go reset. Like, good for you. Like, and not feeling that that was me and not feeling that that was a reflection of me, that again, it's stored. So I think that it's really, what I want to offer and invite is a reflective question, you know, where you may have attachment to the things that you're creating, and whether that's like serving you and serving the energy that you need to keep creating. Okay, that's number one. Let me see if there's anything else that I want to, and I think that, you know, you may ask like, well, how do I detach? Like, what am I supposed to do, right? And I think the first thing is to really recognize if you are attached. You're like, how much of myself is like, am I seeing in this organization? How much am I saying like, this is who I am and this is a reflection of me and it cannot go on unless like I'm part of it, you know? And so one is like, obviously self-awareness and naming it. And then, like I said before, I think two is actually like grieving the attachment, letting it die, feeling like a death between you and this person who like felt so close, and it felt like often we use this language like, oh, my organization's my baby, you know, my baby's growing up, right? And it's kind of the same attachment that a parent might have to their child that actually becomes a really unhealthy cycle as the child starts to you know, grow up, where like, no, it's not your baby, right? That child is its own consciousness and it's come through you and you have been a vessel for it, and that is beautiful. And like at some point you have to, you know, allow it to take its own course. And so, you know, to build something that lives on without you is such a great testament to actually the work that you've done. And so when you're thinking about building, how do you start to think about, how will this live on without me? How is it its own consciousness to live on without me? Okay, so the second thing that I want to talk about is like the ingredients to thrive, you know. And when you are in a leadership position, or you're self-employed, or you have a little bit of agency, like how you like to work, you actually get to like really think about what this means for you, right? And so what's been really fun at Artscape, as we've been, you know, kind of as I've been joining the team and getting to know the team and figuring out how we want to work together, is actually like asking these questions of like, what do we all need to thrive? Like, we're not going to operate in the same way. And sometimes we live, you know, we work in organizations that are quite rigid in prescribing the ways we operate. But if you're in a leadership position and you actually have the opportunity to design new ways of working, like that is a gift that you can give to yourself and you can also give to others. And I think in many organizations that is changing, but you know, we still think of the 9 to 5 in a certain way. And so some of the questions that, you know, I've been asking to my team and I've been asking myself is like, you know, things like, how do we want to communicate? Like, how do we want to talk to each other? Do we want to email? Do we want to text? Do we want to Slack? Like getting like super granular of like, what does it look like for us to like be in collaboration with each other? Because actually everybody has a preference and we have so many different communication platforms. And in some ways we actually get to choose, and we get to choose the thing that works for us, right? So for me, I'm like not an email person. Like I love Slack. I love quicker communication. Like that's what I need to thrive. The second thing is like, how do you create? What is your creative process? Do you want to be in a collaborative creative process, or are you someone that likes to go into a room and be by yourself and not speak to anybody for 3 days and just like dive deep? Because we can actually create the space for you to do that. Otherwise, we're going to try to do these brainstorm sessions and they're going to be like super awkward and we're actually not going to get anything out of it. But how do we continue to think about like, how do we design and structure the way we want to lead and work together? The other thing is like time of day. So I am not a morning person at all. And I have so much shame around not being a morning person. Like this is like, and part of this shame is because, of recent, I think maybe in the last decade, there's just been so much propaganda of like what it means to be a morning person, right? It's like, if you're not a morning person, you're not successful. If you're not waking up at 4 a.m., you are useless to the world. And so I think, part of my nature is to be kind of a natural rebel, but like, I am just not a morning person. Like, I just do not thrive from, I like to wake up, but I just like a slower morning. Like, I'm not like a this, I'm like a this and then like a this. And so, what's been really beautiful in sort of this new position that I've joined is actually like asking everybody, like, what time do you thrive? What time do you want to come into the office? Like, what time do you want to work? What's the optimal time for you? How do we find synergy there? Because we actually don't need to be here 9 to 5. We have the luxury of that, and so we can gift ourselves with that. And then things like, do you want to work in the office? Do you want to work from home? Do you want to go to a coffee shop for an hour? Like, these are all like really granular things, but I think that, I come from a very design thinking background, and I use design thinking and the design thinking process to really think about how to create containers. To me, everything's a container, This is a container where Julian thought about what are the rules of engagement. Our homes are containers, our teams are containers, our organizations containers, our cities are containers, right? And in them, if we design them well, we actually like can thrive, and like people can thrive in different ways. And so when I think about sustainable leadership, I think about like, how do we create the container for everybody to be sustainable in this container? Okay. I think that's, yeah. And then the third thing is really around integrity. Integrity as it relates to like politics, as it relates to power, as it relates to our privilege and our positionality. And like, you get a group of people together and there's politics and there's power, no matter what. There's politics and power in this room, whether we acknowledge it or we don't acknowledge it, right? Like, Julian has more power here. He has created this circle. He will decide like what will happen, and therefore he has a certain level of power, right? And so all of this looks very different in our organizations, and I think we all know this. But what actually happens, right? We either enter into organizations or teams where there's archaic forms of power, right? We just like, most things are built on top of like the patriarchy, and so we just enter into that system and exist within that system and feel oppressed by that system. And then in other ways, sometimes power is assumed. It's just never named, right? It's there, everybody knows about it, but nobody ever talks about it. And it's actually like, it's an uncomfortable conversation until it's not, right? I think, I wonder, someone said this to me, and I'm sure some of you have heard it, but often when you're and I hate confrontation. Like, I just, like, it's a muscle that I've had to like learn. And in learning that, someone shared with me, you only have to be courageous for 20 seconds. Like, you only have to be courageous to get like the first word out of your mouth, or even to be like, hey, can we have a talk? Or like, can we talk about something? That in itself is like, takes a tremendous amount of courage. But I think it's a muscle and it's a habit, and we can all practice it. And so part of like being someone who like designs spaces and designs community and designs culture is really thinking about how do we set up the right container for people to feel safe, right? And setting up a culture that people see themselves in, that have like values that are in alignment with them. And so I often say like a good rule of thumb is if your organization has a lot of like gossip, like not the kind of gossip that's kind of like fun, but kind of the gossip where like everyone's in a meeting and then like, you know, the meeting adjourns and you look over to someone and you're like, I can't believe they did that kind of thing. That is like an indication of like the cracks in your culture. It's an indication that you're likely not having hard conversations. You're not just like naming what is real. So in addition to Reset, I also had a production company with the same business partner, and so we've transitioned out of both. And we did a lot of client work. And so if anybody works in client services or an agency, like, you know, you start to understand how to develop projects with a client. And time and time again, we would, you know, have like our first kickoff meeting with a client, and they would be like so excited, you know, they have all the vision, they want to change the world, do the most innovative thing. They're like, we want you to lead, that's why we brought you in. And slowly as you go through the process, you realize like you're actually not in power. You know, you actually don't have power. You've been brought in, yes, maybe to execute, but not to like lead the creative vision in the way that you thought you did. And so over time, I've just really learned this lesson of like, how do you set things up properly? And part of it is actually like saying the thing that's really uncomfortable. And the thing that can feel really uncomfortable is like, who's in power here? Like, let's just talk about like, what are the power dynamics here, right? Like, I'm on a project right now, and my client is a white, older man who is extremely wealthy. And I'm, you know, a woman of color, much younger, who actually doesn't have access to that kind of wealth. So the power between us is like, yes, he has hired me, so that power is inherent, but there's a lot of actually unspoken power in our relationship. And if I don't name it, and if we don't talk about it, then what happens is I just build resentment, right? And what happens with resentment is resentment calcifies in our body. Resentment exists in places in our body that causes stressors and, you know, some of the things that the other ladies have spoke about. But for me, it like slows me down, right? All of a sudden, like for me to be a sustainable leader, I need energy to move like this, right? I need energy to come in and energy to come out. But all of a sudden, I start to get angry and I start to resent because we're not on the same page. We're not in alignment, right? We haven't talked about what is real here about how we make decisions, how we exist in space, and so then it turns into stuck energy in my body. And all of a sudden, energy is not moving. It's like, so getting anything done actually takes like 3 times the effort, right? But I think what I've learned is that when I can just name it in a place of compassion, from a place of compassion, from a place of vulnerability, from a place of shared learning, not being accusatory, you know, not being aggressive for the sake of being aggressive, but just being like, hey, like this is what's up, you know, like how can we actually create a container where we can both thrive given the power and the privilege and the positionality. Just allows my nervous system to be like, we've talked about it, you know, and we can talk about it again as things arise. But really, like when you're founding an organization, running an organization, have a new team member come in, how do you have those conversations up front to then create the opening for you know, the long-term sustainability of your relationship and your leadership? So I think that's my time. That was a big ramble. I hope it resonated, or some part of it resonated. And thank you. I really see all your presence.